So if we can just hold all questions until Dr. King is done with his presentation. And Dr. King, we asked Dr. King to join us and talk about the National Historic Preservation Act, and how it can be used in the fight to keep our wild equines on their lands. We felt that the recent situation with the National Park Service trying to get rid of the entire herd in the Theodore Roosevelt Park, that this was the perfect time to have Dr. King come join us for this talk. So I'll turn this over to Dr. King now. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. King.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Welcome.
good. Well, thank you. And please, it's Tom, not Dr. King.
Okay. All right.
Anyway, I do not have a particularly organized presentation here tonight because, well, I'm just going to talk off the top of my head about what I think you might be able to do with the National Historic Preservation Act. And please feel free to interrupt me at any time and tell me you don't understand or tell me you think I'm wrong or whatever. Background, the National Historic Preservation Act has been around since 1966, and it was enacted essentially to protect fine old buildings and things like that everybody treasured. Over the years, it's been recognized that fine old buildings are important to many people, but there are lots of other things that are historically important too. And those things need to be addressed and need to be given some measure of protection. Now, the National Historic Preservation Act does not give anything a great deal of protection. It specifies that things can be eligible for a National Register of Historic Places. And that's, we argue a lot about whether a given thing is eligible for the National Register. Now, I see a note in the chat. Is there a question or a comment or a brickbat? Okay, guess not. So what the Act does is it sets up this National Register, which is in the National Park Service, unfortunately. And the Park Service protects it vigorously. Then it directs all federal agencies to, and I quote, take into account the effects of an action that they're proposing to undertake. And through a regulatory process that's tagged on to the law, they consult with state historic preservation officers, with parties of interest, with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is an independent body formed specifically to advise federal agencies about how to take care of historic stuff. Okay, so there would be, I think, some merit in asking the Park Service how it has or how it proposes to comply with Section 106 with regard to doing away with this herd. The herd has obvious historic significance. It's easy to make that case. And the Park Service should do what it can to protect the historic integrity of that herd, according to the National Historic Preservation Act. But of course, the problem is that the Park Service controls the National Register. And the National Park Service traditionally has held that animals do not qualify for the register. Now, there was one court case back in the 90s, and it didn't concern well, it concerned the National Historic Preservation Act, but it was with its rather obscure international provision dealing with with dugongs who are listed in Japan's equivalent of the National Register of Historic Places. And the federal government, Department of Defense in this case, of course, took the position that these couldn't be eligible. They could not, we don't deal with animals. That's not what we do. And the court said, well, now, wait a minute. You deal with trees. There are a lot of trees on the National Register. And it's hard for this court to see that there's a clear distinction between trees and animals. They're all growing, living things out there in the environment. Please explain to us what makes the difference. Well, the Park Service didn't. Nobody ever did. And nobody ever has. So the question remains ambiguous. Now, coincidentally, well, I should back up again. Back in the late 80s, well, wait a minute. Are we okay so far? Does all that make a degree of sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Yes,
Okay.
Tom.
Okay, cool, good.
Would-
Well, then let's back up to the 1980s when I was at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. I should say I am not federally employed at all at this point. I am strictly an outsider. But at that time, I was with the Advisory Council, and my late wife was with the Park Service. And we had a couple of cases that involved places that were not fine old buildings, but were important to communities. In one case, an Indian tribe. In another case, an immigrant community in an urban area. And both were adjudged by the relevant agencies to be not eligible for the National Register, and therefore they had no responsibility to consider them. We thought that was pretty clearly wrong. And so through a set of political machinations that I've gone into in a couple of publications, we maneuvered the Reagan administration into issuing a guideline, not a regulation, but a guideline that said, look, there are these things called, we've called them traditional cultural properties or traditional cultural places. And they can be eligible for the register simply because of their association with the beliefs and values of a community. Now, Indian tribes have used this provision to pretty good effect. They've used it in a lot of court cases and generally been successful in forcing federal agencies to consider, not always very wisely, but to consider impacts on these places that are important to the community. The Park Service makes it very convoluted, but it doesn't have to be. The basic direction of the bulletin is that if a community thinks a place is important to its traditional history, then it ought to be treated as such for purposes of Section 106, the section of the National Historic Preservation Act that directs federal agencies to consider the effects of their actions. So, coincidentally, right now, the Park Service is updating Bulletin 38, and they have it out for comments. And so I would strongly recommend that everybody write to the Park Service and tell them that they ought to be sure to include animals, notably wild horses, and certainly herds like the one you're dealing with, as eligible for the National Register. The Park Service will resist this, But if there are enough people who comment, it'll be hard for them not to do something. And that's what the Park Service always wants to avoid, is doing really anything.
Yeah.
So
It might be
that's
interesting to note. It might be interesting to note that at this moment, on February 13th, I believe, the North Dakota legislators are going to pass a resolution asking the park to keep the horses as representatives of the ranching history in North Dakota,
good.
which would make
Really?
them, yes, and it's a pretty good chance that it's going to pass. It's got
Reach.
it's got a lot of support.
Well, the
Good.
resolution is asking the National Park Service to keep the horses in the park. That's on the 9th and for the Senate, and then we don't have a date for the House yet. But also Robert
Thanks, Chris.
Utley has tried to fight this 106 until he died last year. And it's done no good. I don't understand like how we get around that. I mean, when people like him have testified in front of the North Dakota legislators and argued with the park. I don't understand how we get that to work for us when they're just blatantly ignoring it.
Well, it's hard, no question. I mean, I have the same problem with cases that I get involved in. And not knowing how the case was presented in this instance, I'm not in a position to really make specific recommendations. But I'd be happy to help write things if you'd like.
I would love that very much. If it's something where we have a sign on our website where we can get direct emails going. So it's something that should go to like the head of the National Park Service. Do we bypass this park and do that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably go to the Secretary of the Interior.
Right.
We have a saying in my profession, archaeology, that archaeologists start at the top and work down. And I think that is usually a pretty good rule.
So if we did a call to action asking people, we could draft something, we can work with you on that. I'd be more than happy to. My name's Chris, by the way. I'm with Chasing Horses, Wild Horse Advocates. We've been
Thank you, Chris.
really beating the drum for this for the last, 60 days or so.
Hey,
Go ahead. So yeah, so if you have suggestions on verbiage to use, we'd be more than happy to share that with our followers so that we can get that out and try that again. But I know it's been tried before. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, well, I'd like to see what's been tried before, if you've got it handy.
What I do know is that like Robert Utley had testified, he has written testimony I can send to you.
Good.
I know because they were trying to get the Nakota horses preserved because they're the original horses that were in the park.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure what other things have done, but I know that he's been arguing this for a while. And, unfortunately he passed away last year, but he did what he could to try to raise attention to 106. So.
Okay, good. It would be very helpful to see what he said and what the Park Service said in response,
Okay.
if anything.
Okay. I believe that they were all part of the same hearing, and there were people there from the Park Service at the state level that were fighting it. So yeah, afterwards, or I can exchange information with you, or I can get it from Tree Site, either way. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, good. I see a question here. Can a petition to the National Park help? Frankly, I doubt it.
Yeah.
It would be nice if the Park Service paid attention to petitions, but that's not something they're very good at. It wouldn't hurt.
I have a question. is it possible to have archaeological digs to find horse skeletons?
Well, it's certainly
It-
possible, but whether it would be useful, I'm not sure.
Well, I think it would be useful for the DNA of a horse bones.
Well, I mean, one could do an archaeological project to unearth horse bones. I've unearthed horse bones in archaeological work, and so that could be done, and you could probably find some. But then, what does that do? That shows you that you have a line of DNA running back to the Sitting Bull herd. No, that could be useful, but
or it could be earlier than the Sitting Bull herd.
True. You could.
It could be.
Problem with that is that there is no DNA on the Sitting Bull herd.
Ah, that's too bad. Well, I'm obviously very ill-informed about this, so it's hard to give good advice.
That was also part of the argument that Robert Utley made, that just because we can't prove that they're not historical doesn't mean that they're not. You know what I mean? Like you can't expect, DNA from the 1800s. They didn't do that then. So
Yes, but you can prove that there's been DNA from like the Bronze Age or later or earlier. You could prove that.
Yes, you could excavate horse bones from, say, 4,000 years ago, and show a line of continuity to horses alive today. But that would be
They
a very
a DNA. They have done a DNA study on the genetics of this herd and found that they have found that the DNA, the mother's DNA, goes back to the horses from Asia. So they could have proof that the horses are related to those horses.
Okay, well, that's something that could be useful evidence. But I was going to say that with regard to doing new archaeology to pursue horse DNA, that's very expensive and very chancy. Maybe you find something and maybe you don't.
Yeah, I see.
I think part of the problem with DNA is that you would want, in this particular case anyway, to show that the horses were related to Sitting Bull and other tribal, during that era, during that time period, to substantiate the paper trail and whatnot that they have, the evidence that they have. And in order to do that, you would almost have to find some sort of tribal archaeology dig where there's evidence of all of that, to, if that's making any sense at all. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense there, but
it would make a very interesting research question for somebody doing archaeology on the Little Bighorn battlefield. There must be native horses that were killed in that battle and that wound up somewhere. And if one could find their bones, then one could do something with them. But
hi, Tom. This is Val. I'm sorry I was late. I was on a call with lawyers from BLM for another case that we're doing. I just wanted to tell you, I heard them talking about Mr. Utley, and he was the historian for the National Park Service.
Yes,
they had another historian that was on after that, Castle McLaughlin.
Right.
Both of them gave quite an accounting of these horses that the National Park Service didn't like. So they simply ignored those things and went ahead.
Sure.
So I wanted to make sure you knew who they were talking about.
Yeah, well, Bob Utley was the guy who hired me for the federal government. And so I knew him pretty well. I think I've met Castle McLaughlin, but I never really knew her. But I think they were right, and they should have been attended to. But the Park Service is very, very good at ignoring anything it doesn't want to hear.
Do you think now that we've gone past the scoping public comment period, that bringing the Historic Preservation Act in at the comment period for the EA will have an effect, or are we really looking at taking it to court?
Well, okay, they're doing an EA. You know what the purpose of an EA is, theoretically.
Yeah, just to let the public comment so they can fill that need for NEPA.
Well, no. What NEPA says about an EA is that an EA is designed to determine whether you need to do an EIS. And there's a whole series of questions that are supposed to be asked in the course of doing an EA. Most agencies have just forgotten all that, and they just say, okay, we're going to do an EA, and the EA is going to show that we don't need to do an EIS, and let's go on. And they do it, and everybody lets them get away with it. But there are legal standards, and those can be cited. So if they have not yet come out with their EA, or even if they have, you're not too late, and it would be perfectly appropriate to comment, and comment strongly about the inadequacy of the EA with respect to the horses.
Okay, yeah, they've basically said we're only going to have to do an EA, but if we find something in the EA that says we need to do an EIS, we will.
Yeah,
And,
well, that's legally correct. That's what the law says, that you do an EA, and most things get filtered out that way.
Right.
But an EA should reveal whether there's the need to do an EIS, and then you got to do it.
And they would have to state in the EA how they considered the Historic Preservation Act, and if they haven't, then we have a claim there. Correct?
Absolutely. The National Historic Preservation Act is a separate statute, and they can't just sort of say, well, we did an EA, and we determined there was nothing there. The Section 106 is a separate legal standard that the agency has to follow.
Okay. Do you know of any case where anyone has tried a decision that they've made with wild horses using Section 106?
Yes, but it didn't turn out terribly well. It was with the Army at Fort Polk in Louisiana.
Okay.
And they were doing away with a whole bunch of horses. And the Tulane Law School has a program that helps people deal with things like this, and they took it on, but I don't know where it actually ended up.
Not good. It wasn't good.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, no, it didn't go well. The Army came in and they got rid of the horses.
Yeah, well, the Army can do that, but
yeah.
I think we have a stronger case here because those horses were there and were a big part of the park before it was even created. And you know, we brought forth the issue that they're not legally livestock under the federal definition of livestock, and so I'm hoping that we can take this more in the direction of the historic value of this herd. And I think that this is Section 106 is going to be one of the big answers for us. So I will make sure I email you and Chris each other's email addresses so that you can work with her on the language, because I think her organization is going to be the one that does take this to court. So I think it would be useful for you to work with her on the language and get an initiative going from the people to send those letters into Deb Holland and see if we can get some traction.
I think that's a good idea.
Right.
And now I have I see a question here from Craig Downer, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Yes, that's it. Above that, there's a question. Only did in 1% of cases, correct, Tom? EIS. I think what you're saying is that EISs are done in only 1% of cases. That's probably about right. I don't know that for sure, but that's probably about right. You've got several filters in the National Environmental Policy Act through which projects pass. They can be categorically excluded, or they can be washed out with an EA, or they can be done with an EIS, or they can require an EIS. And it may very well be that EISs are done on average only in about 1% of cases.
Would that be all agencies or just the National Park System?
Well, I don't know what the National Park Service numbers are. That is probably ascertainable, but I don't have that information.
Okay. I have another question as well. Can you tell me the difference between Section 206, 106 and Section 110, please?
I don't know about Section 206. Section 106.
106, I'm sorry.
Okay, Section 106 tells agencies that they must, quote, take into account the effects of their proposed actions on historic places. That is, items and places eligible for the National Register. Section 110 is a much more general provision that tells agencies to do good things with historic places. But there are guidelines. There are regulations for Section 106. There are guidelines for Section 110, and they interlock in ways that theoretically encourage agencies to do the right thing, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. The only other question I had was the nomination of a historic preservation site. If that nomination, is it best coming from the state or from a person or from an agency?
Well, first off, you don't need to nominate anything.
Oh, okay.
The law since 1972 has said that historic places mean properties that are included in the National Register and properties that are eligible for inclusion in the National Register. And a great deal of work is done to determine whether things are eligible for the National Register. But you don't have to do a formal nomination, which is a good thing because it's the National Park Service that controls the nomination process. And
okay.
even if they're on your side, they're going to nitpick you to death. So I try to avoid ever nominating anything to the National Register.
Okay.
I was recently involved in a case in Alaska where we showed, I think in no uncertain terms, that this great big watershed was eligible for the National Register. but the lawyers decided that we ought to nominate it. And this was being done by an Alaska Native corporation, and it cost them tens of thousands of dollars, delayed the project, delayed the whole enterprise a great deal, and complicated the situation. So I really try to stay away from nomination.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
In the case that was tried with Okinawa and the dugong.
Yeah.
Do you think that it would be different here where you've got the citizens versus federal agency as opposed to the United States versus another country? Was it Japan that brought that case?
It wasn't Japan, the country. The Japanese government and the US government were pretty much lockstep. It was citizens, Japanese citizens, Okinawan citizens who brought the litigation. And they're very effective. Though in the end, I think the Defense Department got away with building the base that they set out to build, but they had to make a lot of changes and a lot of accommodations to keep the dugongs alive.
Okay. Yeah, it seems to me an animal is an animal is an animal. So here we've got a very good comparison between the two cases. So I think that would be a good case for Chris to be able to refer to as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Does anybody else have questions that haven't been answered or asked in the chat that you want to ask now?
I actually have another question. I'd like to know where you have succeeded in a case whereby the people have won in actual fact.
Well, yeah, there have been a number of cases where the people actually have won. One that comes to mind is Badger 2 medicine in Wyoming, Montana, up there in the north anyway. And this is a great, huge area that the Blackfeet people regard as spiritually important. And they eventually won that case. And the opposition was oil and gas interests who wanted to drill holes all through it. And eventually the federal agencies, Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service, agreed to just say no and prohibit their doing the drilling.
Excellent.
And so that happens, and that's happened fairly often with traditional cultural property cases. The federal government doesn't know very well how to deal with these things.
I see.
So Tom, could you tell people too, I know you have a couple books and I have one that's specifically on Section 106 that you wrote. Can you maybe tell people the name of a couple of the books that might be relevant and where they can find them?
Oh, let's see. I don't have them right here in front of me.
Sorry.
I try not to read my own books. Geez. But let's see.
I'll tell you what I can do then. I can actually post a couple titles of books of yours that I've read that have been helpful to me